Welcome to this webinar on the question of apartheid in Palestine and Israel. My name is Ghada Zidan, and I'm the moderator of this session, together with Sue Maxwell, who will be moderating the Q&A part. Our previous webinar focused on international law and apartheid, and our speakers were Professor John Dugard, who described the connection between apartheid and colonialism. He also discussed apartheid within the framework of international law, drawing on the experience of South Africa. He referred to the 1973 UN General Assembly vote on the Convention on the crime of apartheid, where apartheid was defined as a crime against humanity, almost on the same level as genocide. Since then, 112 states became a party to the convention, and Palestine is also a party since 2014. However, prosecution of the crime of apartheid was left to national courts. Until the day of today, no national court has prosecuted anyone on the crime of apartheid, not even in South Africa. In 1998, the Rome Statute created the ICC. And one of the crimes against humanity that the ICC can prosecute is apartheid. And since Palestine's accession to the convention, the ICC has jurisdiction on crimes committed within the occupied Palestinian territories. However, according to Professor Dugard, the ICC has no jurisdiction over crimes committed by Israel in Israel itself. Our second speaker in the webinar last time was Professor Virginia Tilley, who explained how Israel's overriding mission has always been to become and remain a Jewish state, and how this mission informs the legal system, policies, and practices of Israel vis-à-vis Palestinians, all Palestinians, whether they are citizens of the State of Israel, or Palestinians in the occupied territories, or Palestinian refugees, or even Palestinians in the diaspora. This system operates as one regime to ensure domination over non-Jews in historic Palestine and to maintain an overwhelming majority of Jews in that area. Professor Tilley also added that for dealing with apartheid outside the 1967 occupied Palestinian territories, other avenues than the ICC can be explored. For example, she mentioned that we can explore the possibility of doing that within the UN Special Committee of Apartheid. So our webinar today builds on the previous one and will focus on mechanisms of apartheid and apartheid in practice in Israel, in the diaspora, and in the occupied Palestinian territories. But before we start with our speakers, before I introduce them to you, let me explain a couple of rules of how we're going to go about this session. First, in the beginning, we have two presentations with our speakers, and that will be followed by a Q&A session. The audience can practice through sending their questions using a chat button, which is in front of you. And our co-moderator, Sue Blackwell, will gather your questions and prepare them for the Q&A session. Please do send your questions during the presentations of the speakers. We will stop taking new questions during the Q&A session. So when we start with the Q&A sessions, we will not take any new questions. Also, please make sure that your question is short, to the point, and do indicate who of the speakers the question is addressed to. Sue, would you like to add something regarding the Q&A session?
No, I think you've said it all. Thank you. So I shall switch my video off now, but I'll be lurking and listening, and I'll come back in when we get to the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sue. Okay, let's go directly to our speakers. I will start by introducing our first speaker, Ms. Diana Buttu. Diana is a lawyer, an activist, and a commentator based in Haifa. She earned degrees from the University of Toronto, Queen's University, Kellogg Northwestern, and Stanford Law School. Diana will speak about the Israeli law and its role in achieving and maintaining Jewish hegemony. Diana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. I especially want to thank the organizers, and thank you, Ghada, and thank you, Sue, for co-hosting today and for co-moderating. And also many thanks to all the people who helped put this together. I'm really delighted to be sharing a platform with people who I very much respect, such as John Dugard, Virginia Tilley, and of course Kholoud, who will be speaking today, and Ronnie Castrols. I believe that this is a really wonderful series of webinars, and I'm very honored. I've been specifically asked to talk about the issue of apartheid inside Israel, and I think that it's important to put it in its proper context. When we speak of Israeli apartheid, this is something that has been discussed for many, many years, including a US president, President Carter, who wrote about this issue. But mostly the focus has been on the situation of apartheid in the West Bank, and to a lesser extent in the Gaza Strip. There was even less focus on the Gaza Strip in the aftermath of the 2005 Israeli disengagement from the Gaza Strip. And for the most part, the focus has been on the similarities between apartheid in South Africa and between the apartheid that is practiced by Israel. Now, I want to be clear that while there are many, many similarities between the ways that South Africa practiced its apartheid and the way that Israel practices its apartheid, it's important for us to recognize that this alone isn't a sufficient analysis. Now, unfortunately, due to personal circumstances, I was not able to attend the first webinar by Drs. John Dugard and Virginia Tilley, two people, as I mentioned, who I deeply admire. So I hope that my analysis here does not overlap or repeat too much what either of these scholars mentioned. So to begin with, is Israel an apartheid state even inside the borders, even inside 48? And the answer, of course, is a resounding yes. At its core, Israel seeks Jewish domination, Jewish supremacy over the territory, over all of the territory under its control. Now, the way that it has been practiced, of course, is very different and has taken different shapes and forms over the years, but at its core, that idea of Jewish supremacy, Jewish control, Jewish domination over the territory has been the foundational and remains the foundational. And here I really want to highlight a few things in the way that we've seen apartheid operate over the years. And first, I want to highlight history. Now, between the years of 1948, after the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, until 1966, we had a system in which there were roughly 150,000 Palestinians who remained under Israeli control. Now, in order to control and to dominate this population, my parents are two of them, the mechanism that was used was a system of military rule. And I will get into what that means in just a moment. That military rule ended in roughly October, November of 66. And then, of course, June 1967, tomorrow will mark the 53rd anniversary of the start of the occupation. From June 67 until the current day, what we see is occupation, the present form of occupation. And what this means is that there was merely a period of between 8 to 9 months between 1948 until the current day that Palestinians didn't live under some form of military rule. And this is important to highlight because it highlights the origins of Jewish domination, is Jewish supremacy over the territory. And it also shows that the practices that began during that period have continued ever since that time, including having two differing systems in the same territory, two different systems that were in place between 1948, two sets of laws between 1948 and 66, one for Jewish citizens of the state and another set of rules for Palestinians who are citizens of the state. And we see that there's also two differing systems that continue to remain in place since 1967 within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And those two differing systems in particular, when you look at the West Bank, that you have one set of rules that applies to Jewish Israelis and a second set of rules that apply to Palestinian citizens. And so how did this manifest itself? Now, the way that it manifested itself was everything from taking Palestinian land, as we saw in 1948, but then also making sure that people were unable to go back to their land. So I'll give you an example. Currently, we have a number of Palestinian cities and towns that are inside Israel, including the place where my mother was born, which is the city of Nazareth. Now, the areas surrounding, the land that is surrounding the city of Nazareth was land that was expropriated by the state of Israel and continues to be expropriated by the state of Israel. And the land that has been expropriated by the state of Israel is for use only by Jewish citizens of the state. In other words, it's not for use by all citizens of the state, but only Jewish citizens of the state. Now, this becomes important as we get to one of the laws that I'm going to highlight very shortly, which is the Admissions Committee law. But the origins of actually taking land and defining land as being simply for one group and not for another group has in its origins of 1948 and remains in place to the current day. And so we see even in the current day, while we have people who are citizens of the state, they are not entitled to the same rights and not entitled even to access land. Now, I want to highlight here that in terms of how it is that this is manifested. And how it's manifested here is that at their core, the laws of the state of Israel seek to maintain Jewish privilege over land and over the entire territory. And what I want to note in this regards is that an individual's rights do not flow from their citizenship. And this is going to be a little bit of a strange concept to people. Your rights don't flow from your citizenship, but your rights instead flow from what Israel terms as being one's nationality. And nationality, in effect, in Israel, really only means one nation, whether you're Jewish or not Jewish. And what that means is that if you are a member of the Jewish nation, and I want to be clear how they define that, it means being defined as any Jewish person around the world, you are entitled to rights. Whereas if you are not Jewish, you are not entitled to the same class of rights, even if you are a citizen. This therefore leads into two types of laws that we see here in the country. There are those that on their face directly discriminate against Palestinians. And then there are those laws that don't on their face directly discriminate against Palestinians, but indirectly discriminate against Palestinians. And the effect is the same. Now, the human rights group Adala has highlighted that there are 65 such laws that either directly or indirectly discriminate. And this, by the way, their database was updated up until 2017. There's new ones as well, but for the purpose of citation, I wanted to be sure that you know that it's Adala and that they indicate that there are 65 laws. I want to give some examples of what it means in practice. How does this apartheid manifest itself in practice? And I'm going to give you examples of how there is direct discrimination and what that means, and then how there is indirect discrimination and what that means. And as I mentioned, the effect is the same. The first, in terms of direct discrimination, one of the most glaring or blatant laws or ways of manifesting direct discrimination is what Israel calls the law of return. Now, the law of return as contrasted with the right of return. The law of return provides that anybody who is Jewish from anywhere around the world has the right to immigrate to Israel and to become a citizen automatically. Now, I contrast this with the right of return, which is the right that is enshrined in international law, which provides that refugees who have fled have a right to return back to their homeland. Israel, of course, has not allowed the Palestinian right of return, but instead allows only the Jewish law of return. Now, what does this mean in practice? And I can give you a personal example in terms of what it means. My father was born in Palestine. He was born in 1939 in Palestine, in a town that is just outside of Nazareth called Limjedel. He had 6 older sisters. He was the first boy. And in 1948, his family fled from Limjedel and went to Nazareth. And then from Nazareth, they fled throughout the country. Now, he had an older sister who was born many years before he was, my Aunt Latifa. She passed away in 2002, which is why I'm speaking in the past tense. She was born in Palestine. She was raised in Palestine. She was married in Palestine, and she gave birth to her first child in Palestine. In 1948, when she fled because of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, she tried to come back to Palestine. But because she was not Jewish, she was never allowed to take advantage of, or never allowed to be given her right to return to the place that she was born in, the place that she was raised in, the place that she got married, the place that she gave birth to her first child. And you contrast that with any person who is Jewish, who has the right enshrined in Israeli law to be able to take up citizenship inside Israel without having any direct connection. And so this is where you see this direct discrimination, that even though my father is a citizen of the state, he was never able to bring back his sister and her husband and her first child, who were all born in Palestine, and the case of her husband also raised in Palestine. That's one example of direct discrimination, where on its face you see that the law privileges Jewish citizens and only Jewish citizens, or in the case of the law of return, anybody who's defined as being part of the Jewish nation. Now, there's also other laws that discriminate against Palestinians, but indirectly. So what that means is that on its face, the law does not say, thou shalt not, I'll give you an example, thou shalt not rent to an Arab or rent to a Palestinian. But there are laws in place that allow people to go around it. And one of such laws is something that's called the Admissions Committee Law. And in the Admissions Committee Law, it allows for communities of up to 400 households, which is fairly sizable, to reject applicants for residency within that community based on criteria of what they call social suitability and the quote, social and cultural fabric of the town. What this is code for is that it allows committees to reject people, interested residents, who are Palestinian citizens of Israel, as well as other groups as well, solely on the base of their race, their ethnicity, their religion, or other identity. And this mechanism allows the effective implementation of housing segregation between Arab and Jewish citizens. Now, this law was a law that was challenged before the Israeli High Court. And in its challenge before the Israeli High Court, when the Israeli High Court rejected the challenge, in other words, it allowed the law to take shape, what they said was that, of course, people should be able to choose their neighbors. Of course, Israelis should have the right to make decisions within their own state. And what that meant, in effect, and this was a challenge, by the way, directly by a person who was affected, a Palestinian, was what the court was saying, and it refers back to they referred back to the national anthem, and they say that Jewish Israelis should be free to choose. In other words, what they have done, and what the state has always said, or what the court has always said, is that when it's faced with a question or a challenge of is a law discriminatory, and do you want to believe in the state being a democracy or being a Jewish state, on virtually every occasion, the issue of Jewish state runs supreme. In other words, even the Israeli court acknowledges that the issue of Jewish supremacy is something that must be held on to. And this brings me now to, just before my final point, I want to highlight a new development. It's not so new now, it happened about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now, that has now fully enshrined the idea of apartheid inside Israel. And that is the Jewish nation-state law. Now, you may have read about it or heard about it in the news. And so I want to go into this in just a little bit, just to give you a flavor of what it says and what it does. Now, to be clear, this is not merely a declarative law or a confirmation of the status quo. We've always seen that the state's policy of discrimination, we've seen that it's existed since 1948, but there is a major difference between the discriminatory practices that existed and the codification of these policies in a new basic law with constitutional status. Now, when the Jewish nation-state law was passed, it was passed as in effect, a super law with constitutional status, and it lends discriminatory policies against Palestinians. It gives it greater legitimacy, and it even requires the executive, the judiciary, and other authorities to implement them under the rule of law. The law also reduces the grounds under which laws can be challenged. So what does the Jewish nation-state law do? This law constitutionally enshrines, now this is important, it enshrines the identity of the state of Israel as the national home of the Jewish people only. In other words, there's no self-determination for Palestinians. It also identifies Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel, as the area to which this applies. Now, this is important. Eretz Israel also includes all of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And so, in effect, what this new Jewish nation-state law does is that it is lending credence and credibility to the idea that Israel is entitled to annex the West Bank, as there is now talk of annexing the West Bank. The law limits the realization of national self-determination in the state of Israel exclusively to the Jewish people, and it specifies that immigration leading to automatic citizenship is for Jewish people only. And in so doing, the law explicitly rejects the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination in any area of Palestine, and elevates the law of return from that of a regular law to that of enshrining it within the Constitution. The law recognizes that East Jerusalem and the Syrian Golan Heights, which are occupied under international law, are an integral part of Israel, and imposes on their residents the constitutional identity of Israel as a Jewish state. And so what this does is that this law also gives constitutional backing to the state to consolidate Jewish demographic majorities throughout Israel. And it's likely to be used to establish exclusively Jewish towns in areas where Palestinian citizens are most concentrated, including in the Galilee and in the Nakba in the south. The law legitimizes discriminatory land practices, such as the Admissions Committee law that I just mentioned, and it gives constitutional justification to discriminatory budgeting policies that give public funds to Jewish communities and even to Jewish individuals for the purpose of incentivizing them to relocate to certain areas. And so this law has in effect now not just gone and enshrined the laws that have already been in place, but it's elevated them to a new status and to a new height. And so even organizations that would once be hesitant to describe this as apartheid are clearly describing it as apartheid, with Adala being one of those organizations that has said that this definitely falls within the status of apartheid. The question becomes now, what is it that we can do? And this is where I'm going to end. And I think that while we focus on legal methods and legal mechanisms to challenge this apartheid, whether in the ICC or otherwise, I think one of the most basic tools that worked for South Africa, which can also work when it comes to challenging Israeli apartheid and bringing down Israeli apartheid, is that of BDS. And BDS becomes so important because where we see that the international legal system has failed, where we see that the international community has failed, the international community of states, we can see that the people of the world can act and come together and challenge this and make sure that we see a brighter future. I think that by focusing and pushing for BDS, it sends the message to Israel, not only that occupation is wrong, but also apartheid is wrong, and that it's that system of apartheid that must be brought down because apartheid is no longer something that is acceptable in the 21st century. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Diana. Before I introduce our next speaker, I would like to remind you and encourage you to pose your questions. If you have any questions to our speakers, you can do that through the chat button. But please, again, keep your questions short, to the point, and indicate who of the speakers you are addressing with your question. So now our next speaker is Kholoud al Ajarma. She is a researcher and a lecturer on anthropology and Islam at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. In 2018, Kholoud appealed to the British Charity Commission that the Jewish National Fund UK should not be recognized as a charitable organization because it funded the British Park, which is built on her family's village, Ajur. Kholoud's family still has the title deeds of their land in Ajur, but the Charity Commission rejected her claim. Kholoud will speak about the role of the Jewish National Fund in ethnic cleansing and in apartheid. Kholoud. Kholoud, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay, good. I'm not sure if you can see my screen that I'm sharing now.
We do.
But yeah, good. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm Kholoud al Ajarma. I was born in Aida refugee camp, a refugee camp based in the city of Bethlehem. My family, however, and my origin is the village of Ajur, as Ghada just mentioned. Ajur is one of the villages that were ethnically cleansed in 1948, and I've been able to visit the village only once in my lifetime. And when I did, I saw this board that I'm sharing with you, which says the British Park, a gift of the Jewish National Fund of Great Britain. And that is what I'm going to speak about, the case that we had against the JNF UK. But before that, I think for those who are not familiar with what is the JNF and its role in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, I think it's necessary to give some background information. So this presentation is divided in two parts. The first part is historical, focusing on the JNF, its role in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and the ongoing Israeli apartheid. And part, I'll focus more on my personal story with the JNF and our case against the Charity Commission in the UK. So I'm going to start by some information about the JNF. The JNF was established in 1901 following the 5th Zionist Congress that was held in Bal. At the time, it was established for collecting funds to facilitate purchasing land in the land of historic Palestine. It also was established to facilitate the Jewish migration to Palestine. The Hebrew name of the JNF is Keren Kiyemet LeIsrael, which means perpetual fund capital for Israel. And it is an organization that has roots, as I said, from the early 20th century for the purpose of colonization. When the JNF was...
Sorry, Kholoud, are you sharing
Yes.
with us? I don't see it.
Yes, let me see what's the problem here. Can you see it now?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Okay, better. Yes, so these are some background facts about the JNF. When the JNF was established, it was established to acquire lands in Palestine, and the funds were required to make the plan a reality. So the JNF was the mechanism to raise these funds in order to purchase the lands of the original inhabitants of Palestine. You might have seen posters like these in the past. This is a poster of the JNF that was meant for raising funds. It says that the soul of the Jewish yearns for the soil of Palestine, buy it. You might be also familiar with this one, which encouraged tourism to Palestine and visiting Palestine. This is from the 1930s, when it was this idea to purchase the land in Palestine for Jewish only use. However, this idea of purchasing the land was also part of the early ideas of apartheid, because it was land that was purchased especially for the Jewish use. Yusuf Weitz, he was one of the leading figures of the JNF's land department. He said in his memoir, "There is no room for both people in this country. There is no way but to transfer the Arabs from here. Not one village must be left, not one tribe. For this goal, funds will be found." So from the very beginning of the JNF and its leading figures, the idea was that we are going to get these lands in order to kick out the original people who lived there, and in order to bring the Jewish people and to take over these lands. The JNF portrays itself today as almost as an environment organization that works on environmental projects, which I'll come to shortly. But these lands, like the majority of Palestinians refused at the time to sell their lands. And that meant that this dream of buying all these lands was not made true. So the plan then by the JNF and the other parties was to prepare files of which villages should be emptied from their inhabitants. So at the time, also, these are from the memoirs of the masterminds, let's say, of the movement at the time. They prepared what they called the village files. And in these files, they listed a group of issues that, like, they surveyed about the villages that existed in historic Palestine. So they surveyed access roads, layout of the villages, quality of the land, water resources, ages of males in all these villages, and the index of hostility towards the Zionist project. So these village files, according to Yusuf Weitz, they were an instrumental method to see which lands should be ethnically cleansed in 1948. So because of that, the JNF didn't just exist to raise funds, but it actually explicitly was part of the ethnic cleansing that happened in 1948, which makes its existence in a way at the time a war crime in itself. So in 1948 itself, the JNF played an important role in the hostilities that happened against Palestinians. This included the transferring lands from the original owners to the name of the newly established state. They participated in the destruction of villages as much as the military operations. They participated in preventing any cultivation of the lands, and that is also related to not allowing the Palestinians who were forced to flee their villages to return. They participated in making the settlements of the Jewish migrants in a number of villages that they were made vacuum from their original citizens. They also they made propaganda at the time that it was dangerous to return to the villages. Those who would return would be killed, and so on. And this propaganda was aimed at the no return policy against the Palestinians who became refugees at the time. The newly established state after 1948 facilitated land acquisition by the JNF. So most of these villages, that more than 300 villages that were ethnically cleansed in 1948, became under the patronship of the JNF or the Israeli Land Committee, which was another committee that was established later to look after, between quotations, these lands. This map here shows you some of these lands that were taken by the JNF, and the JNF alone planted so-called parks on top of Palestinian villages at the time, and I'll speak about that in a minute. They have today more than 60 parks on the land of historic Palestine, and they have 22 the National Parks Authority. So these parks are seen, or like in most cases, are portrayed when the JNF raises funds, and the JNF has more than 40 offices worldwide in more than 50 countries, and it's registered in most of these countries as a charity. So it's tax exempt. It gets additional funding. Because of that, it can collect money and contributions and so on. And all that money goes to the JNF in Israel. And what happens then is that the JNF claims that most of its projects are to make the land of Israel, quote unquote, green. And so I will look at some of these claims now, and in what writers on this topic often call the greenwashing of the Nakba. So what happened after 1948 is that this greenwashing is a practice that involves pretending to be environmentally friendly in order to deflect attention from criminal activity. So the one aspect of this was planting European trees. There are in many of these parks that were established in historic Palestine. Mount Carmel, for example, is one of them. It's called Little Switzerland. And these trees were planted on purpose. According to David Bongorian in his memoir, these trees were planted to look like or to have a view of forests in Switzerland or Scandinavia. So this idea of these European trees that were planted, these are trees often like they grow very fast and also like very high, and they are not indigenous to the land of Palestine. So the problem is that in many cases, research showed that these kinds of trees destroy the native environment, and they also cause many of the original species to die because they are not they're not original to the land of Palestine. Also, these trees are easier to burn in cases of hazards, whereas the original trees that are planted in different Palestinian areas are fruit trees, for example, that farmers used to live on. So this is one of the aspects of this like environmentally friendly policy. The other is establishing parks and forests to hide the ruins of Palestinian villages. Hundreds of Palestinian villages lie under these parks or forests of the JNF. For example, there is the Canada Park, which is established on top of the villages of Amwas, Yalo, and Beit Nuba. There is the British Park established on top of my original village, Ajur. There is like tens of these parks that are originally villages that were ethnically cleansed in 1948, but these projects and to plant trees on top of the ruins is basically to hide these crimes that happened in 1948. And in a minute, I'll show you some pictures of Ajur where you can see, if a visitor to these places would really want to see, they still can see the destroyed houses and the ruins of the houses that still remained. In many places, like parts of mosques and churches and graveyards still remained, and those who have the right to hike in these places and enjoy them, of course not the original Palestinian citizens, those who can now visit these places sometimes get to see these ruins that are left on the lands that were destroyed. The other point is the destruction of the native environment. As I said, the native environment of Palestine is very distinct. It's a Mediterranean climate, but these species that were planted on top of the villages are not native trees. So they are taking place of the, or killing some of the original species that live there. The other point is that the JNF, through its projects, is trying to fashion what is called a European biblical landscape. We can see this best in some of the places in Jerusalem, where thousands of acres of pine forests are being designed to kind of show a biblical, or to mimic a biblical landscape around the city of Jerusalem. And in one area of Jerusalem, like a Muslim cemetery is being erased to establish one of those forests. And more explicitly, like the biggest of the crimes might be the funding of the Israeli army. Although the JNF claims that their projects mainly focus on land, trees, and water, they research has shown that, for example, the JNF UK, which I'm most familiar with, has donated money, large sums of money, for the war, what they call the war effort on Gaza in 2015. So it's not only like the ethnic cleansing in terms of like the environmental aspect of it, but also funding the Israeli army directly. And the also very important is the idea of destroying Palestinian communities. So what the JNF did from the 1920s until now is continuous. in many places in Palestine, it is trying to continue their effort, let's say, to have this Jewish-only places. And the thing I forgot to mention before is that under the JNF mandate, the lands that the JNF owns or have the custody on have to be explicitly for the Jewish people. So not even the Palestinian citizens of Israel or any non-Jew can either have a property in these lands or have any power over these lands. So it's also like a Jewish exclusive land in itself. So, and one recent example on how that is done is the villages of Naqab, where many communities, many Bedouin communities, and in the Naqab there is about 200,000, I think, people living, and those communities are being displaced starting from 2010 in order to establish what is like seen as this idea of like making the desert bloom. So they are saying that they want to have forests on the top of the desert, but what they are not taking into consideration, of course, is the people or the thousands of people who live there. Al-Araqib is one of the examples. The village was destroyed more than 30 times in the past 10 years. The people still refuse to leave. They're still holding to their right, but the Israeli government is supporting enough. And one example is one of the chiefs of one of the tribes, the Bedouin tribes living in the Al-Araqib. He was sentenced for trespassing on his own land, and he was sentenced to prison for 3 months for being on his own land, according to the Israeli law, illegally. So it's really these sometimes absurd claims that that Palestinians have to deal with when it comes to the JNF. So these are some examples of like what the JNF claims versus what is the reality, or like I tried to follow what the Palestinian opinion is on these claims. Now I'll move a bit into the case of the JNF UK. So as I said, there are the JNF functions in more than 50 countries under the claim that it's raising funds for environmental projects in Israel or in the biblical lands or for the Jewish people, well, however they put it in different websites. And I will talk about Ajur. So Ajur is located between Bethlehem and Hebron, inside the Armistice line. So it was occupied in 1948. My family, both my parents were children at the time, and my grandparents had to flee the village along with all the inhabitants of the village. And I was able to visit a few years ago, and Ajur, or Agur as they call it today, still empty. There's almost nobody living there. There's one house still standing, the house on the right side that used to be the house of the mayor. And some interesting parts that are personal for me is that a lot of the trees that are original species in the village are still there, including the cactus, for example. But the case against the JNF was basically because the JNF claims that the park is a park that was purchased by the JNF, and the JNF has custody on it from the 1950s. With a group of British activists, we wrote to the Charity Commission and asked to remove the JNF from the charity registrar, because as a charity, they are tax exempt, they can send money to the Israeli government and so on. So we tried, that was the first kind of step to try to make the JNF illegal in one way or another. And for the main application, I used the land deeds, as Ghada mentioned, the land deeds that my family still keeps from the land of Ajur. I used testimonies from my grandmother, who's 100 years old and still live in Aida camp, hoping that one day she'll return to Ajur. And I used testimonies from other Palestinians who are originally from Ajur, living in the West Bank, some living in Jordan and the US. And we listed all these crimes that are related to the JNF, specifically on lands of Ajur, including the claim that this land is like quote unquote supported by the friends in Britain, and what we wanted to show is that these lands have owners, and these owners have never given up their right to the land, but because of the actions of the JNF as a method of apartheid, and because of the Israeli regulations and laws, my family and hundreds of others cannot return to Ajur. What the reply was from the Charity Commission is that there was no reason, quote unquote, reasonable cause to complain about the JNF, because in their documents, the JNF is not doing anything against the law. Now, there were two problems mainly in the letter. Like, the whole rejection of the application was harmful, of course, but two most harmful for me were, one is that we had, like, they claimed that we had no reasonable cause, and to generate, like, 4 generations of my family have lived in Aida camp, and they have never given up the right of return or the right to our land in Ajur, which was never given up on, it was never sold. So the idea that they denied our right to kind of to consider our right in our land was a problem. But the other problem was that they have said, we had in the past sent a similar letter to, or application to, the Charity Commission about another park, which was the Canada Park. And at the time they said that this is not related to the JNF UK, which is also bizarre because all the JNFs around the world are connected to the currently Israel in Israel. But anyway, so at the time they said, and that was 5 years before our application, at the time they said it was the JNF Canada and that the JNF UK wasn't related. Now, this time it was specifically the JNF UK. There were so many documents showing that it was the JNF UK that was colonizing over my village. And what they said is that we rejected this claim 5 years ago. We're rejecting it now for no standing, that we don't have a standing. And the bizarre part was not only denying, like, the historical part, but also denying the current history of Palestine. So in the past 5 years, from our application to from the original first application to our application, there were numerous attacks on Gaza. There were numerous attacks on Palestinians everywhere, hundreds of houses demolished, people displaced in different Palestinian areas. Not to mention what was mentioned before about the nation-state law, and also, like, all these injustices that were denied simply because the Charity Commission was not willing to stand against the JNF. So we took the case to the court. Unfortunately, we reached the highest court in the country, and although we had a very strong claim, the resolution was that still we didn't have a standing. And in the words of the judge, it was because they didn't want the British government to get into issues of political controversy with the Israeli government. And this political controversy issue is, like, the important thing there. Until when would these governments put their own political interests in front of human rights and the rights of Palestinians in general? I want to finish with this is a photo of the lands of Ajur today. Of course, many of these trees are planted on top of the ruins of people's houses, but there are hundreds of cactus plants and olive trees and oak trees that are still surviving there, compared to Aida camp, where my family lives, and where hundreds of Palestinians from like 5,000 people live in Aida camp, coming from 30 different displaced villages. And so this is like, just to compare, Aida camp also was said to be the world's most tear-gassed place on earth last year. So to compare what the current situation is to what it could have been is really heartbreaking. And what gives me much hope and resilience is my grandmother, although she has lived for more than 70 years in Aida camp, not a day passes without her mentioning the village and her wish to return. For her, Ajur is a matter of dignity, and that she always would insist that we will return to Ajur, if not to take her bones and bury them there one day when we return. So there is now a campaign in the UK to try to get to raise more awareness about the JNF through the Stop JNF campaign. We're writing to the Security General and trying to get more awareness first, but also to try to actually get the JNF to justice at some point. And I hope that we will one day. And I'll stop here. I'm sorry I went over my time.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Kholoud, for your presentation. We will move now to the Q&A part, and Sue.
Hello. Yes, my audio and video are back on. We've had quite a number of questions coming in. Some of them are for both speakers and some are aimed at one or the other. And I'm going to try and group them together to save a bit of time, and hopefully it will come out in logical order. How long do we have, please? Is it half an hour?
We have a maximum of half an hour, yes.
Okay, good. There are whole numbers on of questions on BDS, and I'm going to group those at the end, if that's okay, and ask you both to comment on those. So to start off with, to go back to Diana, there's a question for clarification. When you talked about access to land, does that mean owning land or other things as well, is the question.
It means both. Thanks for the question. It means both owning land and in some cases also renting land as well. So for example, I'll give you a couple of examples, and I'm so delighted that Kholoud spoke about the JNF or the KKL as they call it here, because for my father's village that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, El Mjedil, was not only destroyed in 1948, but in its place now there is a new Israeli housing and a park, and the sign in the park reads that it was established in 1941. And just for reference, my father was born in 1939, which predates 1951. And so you can see how there's this attempt to erase. Now, the place of his actual house, and there was also a couple of cemeteries. The cemeteries have been removed, the houses have been removed. In the place of his house, there was an attempt by a Palestinian group to try to rebuild, to try to rent the land and rebuild and recreate parts of the village, and even that. There has been an attempt to block that, and so that means not just being able to own the land. This is the land that he actually his father still has deeds to, that he cannot own now because it's been transferred to the hands of the state, and specifically to the hands of the Jewish National Fund. But also there can't even rent that land. So it isn't just a question of owning, but also being able to rent. Now, there's also some parts of the country, in particular in settlements, where there's a lot of profiling, where you are also not allowed to get into, even to just physically access those parts of land. And I can speak to you about, for example, in settlements in Hebron, where I have been profiled and been asked to be able to go into various places that supposedly Israelis are allowed to go, and they have a distinct policy of not allowing anybody who's not Jewish to access those areas as well.
Okay, thank you. Now I have a couple of questions for Kholoud, specifically about the IDF and the army. Is there any information on the proportion of JNF funds that goes to the army, and where has the funding of the army by the JNF been documented? Kholoud,
yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, as for the documentation, it is documented by different human rights groups in the UK, mainly by the JNF Stop the JNF campaign, but also charities in general produce their own kind of papers showing what kinds of funding or where their funding has been going to. So the one that was most striking was the amount that was sent to the war on Gaza in 2015, and specifically for the Israeli army. There is no, like, each JNF really manages its funding differently. So like here, I'm specifically speaking about the JNF UK, but each JNF does it differently. And there was a case with the JNF Canada and one of the organizations affiliated with it, where the activists in Canada were able to deregister one of these organizations, not the main JNF, but one of the smaller organizations related to it, because they found that that organization explicitly was sending money to the Israeli army. And for me, like, it's not a matter of the amount. Any amount, even if it's $1 going to the army, is still a problem, because this is an army that is already like committing war crimes against the Palestinians. So it's not about the amount, but about the action itself from an organization that claims to be like an environmental organization, although we could see through all its history that it's an organization established to support ethnic cleansing.
Thank you. I have some questions for Diana now. The first one is on Silwan, the city of David. Could you please comment on how the settlements there are being facilitated through the nation-state law and any other laws and policies that facilitate such a process of settlement?
So you know, Silwan is not unique. It's in effect all of them, particularly now post the passage of the Jewish nation-state law. One of the issues that the Jewish nation-state law talks about is, let me get the specific article so that I'm in the right, because I sometimes mix that up, is it talks about Jewish settlement. And because it defines the land of Israel, like Eretz Israel as the historic homeland of the Jewish people, it also talks about facilitating the cultural, historic, and religious heritage of the Jewish people. And so part of that is that there's this attempt to try to tie the city of David as a cultural, historical, and religious heritage of the Jewish people. Plus, you have also Article 7 that states that that views the development of Jewish settlement as a national value, and it's going to act to encourage, promote, and consolidate its establishment, right? And so it also, in effect, is instituting segregation as a new legal norm and allowing for annexation of the West Bank. So it's the combination of these two that has been pushing this. But Silwan, to be clear, Silwan is definitely predates the Jewish nation-state law. The actions in Silwan, from just my personal memory, have been going on for as far back as 1990, with protests taking place since then. The issue that's happening now is that it's been accelerated and hastened specifically because we see these, not only this new law that's being passed, but we see extreme, racist, ethnic cleansing government, and the Trump administration that has been pushing this forward as well. In fact, it was there that we saw that that we've seen that the U.S. ambassador has been pushing and promoting all of the settlement construction as well, and has been doing unveiling projects in various settlements. And it's because there's this overall vision that they need to develop the land of Israel, and that we don't matter. We're just kind of flies that are getting in the way of their lovely picnic.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question for Diana. This is from Nadia Sili Chahin. I hope I've pronounced her name correctly, a Chilean lawyer and a Palestinian descendant. And she compliments you on an excellent presentation. Her question, do you think that Palestinians with Israeli citizenship have labor, health, educational, etc. social rights in sum within the Israeli legal system?
No, and this isn't just my words. These are the words of the OECD as well. Israel became a member of the OECD in 2010, and since 2010, there have been report after report after report talking about and labeling, highlighting the discrimination that exists with Palestinians against Palestinian citizens of Israel. I'll give you a few examples. For example, on the area of healthcare, particularly when it has come to the coronavirus, which is why we're meeting virtually rather than in person. We have had to fight both in court and in the Knesset to be able to get even the basics of testing centers for Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. Within the first month of the outbreak of the coronavirus, it had been less than 1% of those who had been tested were Palestinians who were citizens of Israel. And it was only after a number of legal challenges that we saw that this ended up changing. That's just in relation to coronavirus. But in general, if you look at the history of what Israel has done in this area, in all of 1948, all of the Palestinian cities and towns, Israel has not built a single hospital in any Palestinian city or town whatsoever. There are 3 Palestinian hospitals in Nazareth, all 3 of which predate the state of Israel. They were built in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But Israel has yet to build a single hospital in any of these cities and towns, despite the fact that cities that are of a smaller size, that Jewish cities that are of a smaller size, end up getting hospitals built for them. And yet we see that there is a high number of Palestinian doctors and Palestinian nurses, Palestinian pharmacists, people who are within the healthcare sector, but yet Israel has never extended that healthcare sector to actually cover Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. On the level of education, we see that much more money goes into Jewish Israeli schools than goes into Palestinian schools. And I can tell you, just in the city of Haifa alone, the place in which I live, 63% of Palestinian kids end up going to private schools because there isn't enough funding that is given in the public school system. And yet, even though these percentage end up going to private schools where the parents pay out of pocket, Israel then takes that money that parents have paid in the form of taxes and doesn't put it back into the Arabic language schools. Instead, it distributes that money to the Jewish Israeli schools. So we've seen that there's been a huge disproportion when it comes to both health and education on the issue of labor as well. There are very high rates of poverty among Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. And we also see that there is a huge pay disparity between the two. In fact, you can easily discriminate against a Palestinian citizen of Israel and not face any consequence whatsoever. So while Israel talks about on a surface level of having equality, when you scratch the surface even deeper, you see that there's absolutely no equality, whether it's in health, whether it's in labor, whether it's in education, and certainly not when it comes to areas of, as I mentioned, land, where Israel has blocked off the growth of Palestinian cities and has forced Palestinians to either move outside of their cities into other cities, or people have left the place entirely.
Okay, and there's a question that follows on from that, although I think you've touched on it. To what extent do segregational practices also apply to bigger places in Israel above 400 households like Tel Aviv?
In residential terms.
In residential terms.
Yeah,
the question that is clarifying. And how does it work there?
So in residential terms, you will regularly see, you'll see some very interesting, let's say, signage. So first, one thing that we've seen is that since the passage of the admissions committee law, which specifies that it's supposed to be 400 households, multiply that by 5 or 6, and you're looking at the average size of the city not being 400, but it's more like 2,000, 2,500 individuals. These are not small little towns. These are a little bit bigger. We've seen that there have been 2 other things that have happened. One, there's been an attempt to try to extend the size, to pass laws within the Knesset to expand it beyond the 400 to be even larger. But number 2, and more importantly, is that even if the community doesn't fall within the 400, there was an audit that was done that found that communities that were even beyond the size of 400 households were discriminating and were using the admissions committee as a means of discriminating against individuals. Now bring it to the bigger cities such as Haifa, where I live, or Tel Aviv, or other places as well. I think there's 2 things. First is that there are mechanisms for discriminating. For example, if they hear an accent, suddenly a place will become unavailable. And there's been a lot of documentation of Palestinians who have called to find an apartment, and then their Israeli friend calls 2 minutes later without an accent, and suddenly the place opens up. That is very commonplace, and nothing is done against it. But 2, and this is the more important element. As Palestinians, our desire isn't to be able to move to Tel Aviv. That's not what I want. I want my community, which is Nazareth, to be able to expand, and to be able to expand naturally, not upwards, but outwards, as one would expect. For example, in the area of Nazareth, the city that my mother is from and that my father ended up being raised in post 1948, where he has a house to this day, the Israeli state blocked off the borders of Nazareth in 2 ways. In one way, thank you, Kholoud, for the excellent presentation, by declaring parts of the land JNF lands. And so in and around the area of the eastern part of Nazareth, it's completely blocked off. It just has these fake pine trees around it, and nobody is allowed to build because the land has been declared JNF land. But the other way that they did it is that they created something called Nazareth Elite, Upper Nazareth, which they have since changed the name to the View of the Galilee, because they wanted no connection to Nazareth. And in Upper Nazareth, Nazareth Elite, that the lands of Upper Nazareth are 3 times the size of the Palestinian city of Nazareth, with 1/3 the population. And so what was done is that the lands of Nazareth have been given to the city of Upper Nazareth. And so you see open parks, you see soccer fields, you see large spaces for schools, you see trees, you see whatever it is that you want to see. And this is the land of Nazareth. And so for Palestinians, for one, I want to be able to live within my community. I want the land, the city of Nazareth, to be expanded out. It's not my goal to be able to, move to Tel Aviv. That's not what I desire. I want to be able to live within my community and have that community expand naturally. But because of the policies that exist within the state, it has affected our ability to do that. And that's why you see people like me who are now living in places such as Haifa, because this is the only place where we can actually get some level of infrastructure for kids. And even then, it all has to be done in a system that is private. Now, this means that there's a lot of people who cannot afford to move to Haifa, and not just cannot afford to, don't want to. I'm one of these people who didn't want to move to Haifa, but I had no choice because it was virtually impossible to live in Nazareth.
Thank you. We now come to a number of questions about the solution and what action those of us in solidarity with the Palestinian people can take, including BDS, of course. And I'm going to give Diana a break and throw the next question at Kholoud. It's very succinct. BDS for what solution? The question is BDS for what solution? And I think what solution do you anticipate coming out of BDS? I've got an echo. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, there's echo.
Yeah, well, BDS is one way to kind of tackle the current colonization, and I think putting pressure on government is important. I think one of the problems that I see currently, and my friends in Palestine see, is the issue of conditional funding, and how it started with the US aid, but now the European Union has the same policy where Palestinian organizations cannot apply for funding unless they meet special conditions. And this is very destructive because many Palestinian really good organizations who refuse that type of conditions now cannot apply or do not want to apply for funding under these conditions. So I think one of the main solutions for me is to get rid of these kinds of impossible conditional funding mechanisms that countries are imposing on the Palestinians, and to put pressure on governments first to act in relation to like the rights of Palestinians in general. So I think the people in general can do much by BDS and supporting different types of boycott actions. But I think it's also important that governments take a stance and actually participate in that. And I think the measures that can be taken legally as well should be also taken into consideration, and taking such organizations like the JNF, for example, to court is also part of the solution, I think.
Okay, then I have a follow-up question for you that flows from that, since you talked about governments. What must be done from EU countries, other than denouncing the Israeli apartheid policy, in correction of the historical crime which has been and is still being committed against the Palestinian people?
Well, I think many governments, like especially the British government, for example, was part of the problem from the very beginning. So I think there are many laws currently that need to be denounced, including the anti-Semitic law currently, for example, in the UK, and what the meaning of an anti-Semite mean, which is in cases the name of Israel is put there, and in reality there's a difference between being anti-Semitic and being anti-Israeli, and there should be like more awareness about that to start with, and to have more awareness about the rights of Palestinians in general. So governments in many countries they have a lot of deals with Israel, including arm deals, for example. And these are destructive not only for Palestinians, but for people in general. So to really put an end to such practices and deals with Israel in general, I think is part of the solution.
Thank you. You're referring, I think, to the definition of anti-Semitism of the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. That's not officially law, but it's been referred to by lawyers as a quasi-law because it's being treated as if it was. Thank you.
Maybe I missaid it, but in the UK, for example, many organizations and have to kind of acknowledge the definition in order to exist.
Yes.
In a way. So it's also, that.
This is a topic for a whole webinar in itself, I think. Meanwhile, for Diana this time, two related questions on BDS. What would you say to the main Protestant church in Germany that says that BDS discriminates against Jews? And You said BDS is a solution, but unfortunately many countries under pressure, US states and even universities are banning BDS by passing policies and laws. How should this be tackled?
BDS isn't a solution, it's a tool. And I think that that's the part that is really important to recognize, is that the end goal isn't just to BDS, it's a tool that we should be using in order to end Israeli apartheid. Now, when it comes to the issue of BDS and anti-Semitism, you know, this is an old and it's a tired discussion, because what Israel has done is that it has equated every criticism, any criticism that we have against the state of Israel, somehow anti-Semitism, and yet we don't see that the same level of criticism against a state, any other state around the world, rises to that same level. For example, we don't say that criticism against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which commits a number of human rights abuses, that somehow that amounts to Islamophobia. Nobody would ever make that equation, because you have an issue of state action, and then you have an issue of racism and discrimination. And what Israel has attempted to do is conflate the two in order to try to stifle any discussion of any very legitimate discussion of its human rights abuses, and so on and so forth. And so you know, I think that they really need to start examining and questioning what actually amounts to anti-Semitism, and the actions of a state certainly shouldn't be following within that category. Instead, what they should be looking at is what it is that BDS aims to do. And BDS is focused specifically on the state of Israel and the actions of the state of Israel and the institutions of the state of Israel. It's not focused on individuals, it's simply focused on the institutions of the state of Israel, which it's these institutions that are instituting apartheid, and that are making sure that Palestinians are denied their freedom. In terms of what to do regarding all of this anti-BDS legislation, I think we're in the beginning wave of it, and I think we are going to see a lot more of this anti-BDS legislation come up in peak. But at the same time, I think that people are well aware that that this is obviously not just going against principles of free speech. That's the least of it, but that it also is that we need to really hit this full force and start addressing this full on. And I think that people really need to be educated about what BDS really is about. Plus, I think that we need to portray what the alternative to BDS is. So if it is that we are simply allowed to accept Israel for the way it is and to continue to allow it to do what it is that it is doing, it doesn't just have ramifications for Palestinians, forget about the Palestinians, but it has ramifications for the world order as we know it. And specifically now, as we are looking and we are on the verge of annexation, and the world is wringing its hands and not really entirely sure what to do when it comes to annexation. It's easy to simply ignore it and say, oh, this is just a Palestinian issue. But if we look at it in the global picture and understand what this means, it means that we are undermining world order. And it means that states can willy-nilly do whatever it is that they want to do. They can invade other states and annex territory and be able to claim that it's their own, which will lead to more and more and more wars. So if we simply focus on just allowing Israel to do what it can do, this is what the end result is. And I think that this is the part that is very important to recognize and to highlight, is that this is a tool, and it's a legitimate tool, and it's the only tool that we have at our disposal now. Because we've seen that I was part of the team that worked on the case before the wall. We had a wonderful outcome, and yet the world has done nothing about it. So your alternatives are either you support BDS and initiatives that are going to economically sanction Israel, or you turn a blind eye to to other ways that Palestinians have to resist. Like you can't say you're not allowed to resist, and you're not allowed to push for BDS, and you're not allowed to do this, and you're not, you know. So these are the things that I think that people have to be made aware of. Plus, I think when it comes to specifically in Europe and the United States, the argument of free speech seems to work very well.
Okay, I'm going to fire a quick question at Kholoud to give her the last word on this, if that's okay. Regarding the law of Jewish return, should non-Zionist Jews who were born and live in various countries around the world write to the Israeli Department of Foreign Affairs and reject their so-called right to return?
Well, I think like there non-Zionist Jews or different ways they are supporting like the plight of Palestinians, but I think Diana might be better in the like how legally that can be helpful or not is not something I'm really familiar with.
Is there time?
Yes.
Rada, go on, Diana, last word.
I was just going to say very quickly, yes, I think that Israel needs to continue to hear from anti-Zionist Jews that they don't believe that what Israel is doing should be done in their name, and that they are not going to take advantage of the law of return and instead want to hand it over to somebody to give them their right to return. I think that would be a great initiative.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Sue, for the Q&A part. I think we're heading towards the end of our webinar, but before I close, I would like to thank both our speakers for their very valuable contribution today. I also would like to thank all our participants for your participating, but also for the very good questions that you asked. Please do remember that our final webinar in the series is going to be next Thursday, same time. And please do not forget to register for that. Hope to see you then. Thank you all. Thank you.